issues. Rick?
Thanks, Roy. I don't have any slides, and I just wanted to kind of go over some big picture issues that we're kind of grappling with as we review coming applications and looking at what's coming down the line. When I started at the FDA almost 14 years ago, most of our time was spent about arguing about whether a drug worked or not. People trying to slip things past us about failed trials, trying to resurrect failed trials on pre-specified endpoints, subsets of patients, et cetera. And the major issue with approval of drugs in oncology was the demonstration of efficacy. And for the first part of this tenure at the FDA, that occupied most of my time. Now, fortunately, what we're seeing now is drugs, partly because our greater understanding of the disease and the molecular pathways of these diseases, where we see unprecedented activity. And that's useful to everyone, not only for patients to get these drugs, not only to the industry, pharmaceutical industry and academics, but also to drug regulators, because now we're not asking how or should we approve these drugs, but really how quickly sometimes we should approve these drugs. But they also bring up some questions that I think the community in general has to weigh in on. Okay. When we see large effects, primarily we're seeing them in single-arm trials, and we've approved many drugs on single-arm trials, but there are shortcomings with single-arm trials. And here again, as I stated before, we have no problem in doing this, but one has to ask themselves the question, when should we do randomized trials in medical oncology? And we are, in ourselves, in the agency and also in discussing this with our colleagues in Europe, frequently have, arguments among ourselves. For example, when you see a response rate of the range of 50 or 60% with long durations, is it reasonable to ask a patient, or is it reasonable to ask a patient to go on a randomized study where the control arm only has a 10 or 15% response rate? Has equipoise been lost? And therefore, you shouldn't even bother doing this clinical trial. And if you're doing it, why are you doing it? It doesn't make any sense to me, and I cringe when I hear this, that patients are going on trials so they can progress and then cross over to the therapy of interest. That really points to me that that's a trial that shouldn't be done, and I don't know why it's being done in general. And I think we have to have greater questions about this, especially across the ocean, so to speak, where many of these clinical trials are being done, not so much for EMA, but for country-by-country reimbursement issues. And many times in diseases where you have lethal results, lethal diseases with very poor treatment options, such as the chemotherapy trials for melanoma, where patients were randomized to DTIC when we had much better therapies that we knew about. Why are these trials being done? So I think these are cogent questions that we need to answer of when we need a randomized trial. When we do need a randomized trial, because we're dividing these diseases into very small subsets of patients, can these randomized trials be done, and how can we bring industry together in terms of master protocols to do these trials, so we are screening all patients and on a platform of biomarkers, and then assigning individual patients to a meaningful really trial that will be directed toward a molecular pathway and a molecular pathway disease. So I think we have to really think of redoing business in oncology, and this may mean bringing people together that have competitive issues with each other in industry and bringing them together in a room. Many times these trials may even need to be comparative trials, looking at newly approved agents or disease or agents that will be approved. Here again, they don't necessarily have to prove that they're better than each other, but they might need to be compared or at least tested side by side. One of the things that has not been brought up in any of the talks here is an issue that we grapple with because we're looking at a risk-benefit situation or a benefit-risk. But I have heard no one at all mention the word safety this morning. And this is a issue. Just because a patient has a malignant disease does not give anybody the right to just be carte blanche and give them any drug without any knowledge of the safety of the drug. And we have to come into an understanding of what that safety is. And obviously, many of you are aware of a recent action that we took last week looking at safety of a particular drug. Single-arm trials do not give us comparative safety issues or comparative safety data here. They give us a snapshot in time of a safety of a particular population or adverse events that occurred, but one doesn't know whether these are associated with the drug, one doesn't know whether they are associated with the underlying disease. It is very uncomfortable to look at physician-assessed safety or ascertainment of safety from physicians in single-arm trials, because obviously there may be inherent biases that people have in assessing safety. And here again, I'm not saying that anyone has an intent of a fraudulent intent here, but it is a subjective judgment that one has. And these are particularly bothersome if you're dealing with safety issues such as myocardial infarction, stroke, etc., that could occur in a general population. So if the Institute of Medicine is looking for new topics, I think this is a prime topic to look at, because remember, it's not just about the efficacy, it's a risk-benefit situation. It's interesting, the one drug that we had the safety issue with, there's a publication that will be coming out shortly in a prestigious journal on this drug, which we did not know anything about. The conclusion in the abstract was this drug has efficacy in the disease, but doesn't mention anything about the safety of the drug in the abstract, which here again, I think we have a love affair, so to speak, with the efficacy issue, but we have to keep in mind that these are patients. They have a right to know about the safety of these drugs, and the safety has to be well delineated. Just a few words about molecular pathways. And I think that this goes to comments that Barry Kramer was alluding to, and also what Liz mentioned in her last statement about what we don't know and what we do know. These are very complicated issues, okay? What are the pathways? Do we know all the pathways that are operative? Do we know how selective these drugs are? Could they have untoward consequences, unrecognized safety issues, different pathways and different known histopathological diseases may have different levels of activity. For example, BRAF inhibition or manipulation of the BRAF pathway in melanoma may be very much different than in colon cancer. So, we have to have some humility here when we approach these diseases. Because remember, we are, and let's step back, looking at these diseases in the context many times of existing therapies that may have not the best efficacy, but at least some efficacy here. And we have to put these results in these contexts of the disease. As we move toward these molecular pathways, I want to emphasize that we want to be partnering with the academic community in developing these therapies. We do not want to look that the regulatory pathways are inhibiting the progress of molecular pathways or molecularly directed therapies. One does not need to have an approval for gastric cancer or colon cancer or a specific subtype of colon cancer. There is nothing in the legislation that would prohibit us from approving a drug for inhibiting pathway X or inhibiting pathway Y without any reference to a known established disease here. So that is open. So we do have that degree of flexibility. But also, when we're talking about the pathways here, let us remember that there are other avenues that are being looked at in drug development. The checkpoint inhibitors, manipulation of the immune system that may have profound effects also on this therapy. And we can't just look at what's going on in oncology just with a tunnel vision directed toward one area of particular interest here. So I think to just echo with what Liz has said, one of our concerns is what we don't know. And here again, that is sometimes the most really challenging aspect in regulating these drugs.
Thanks, Rick. Does anyone want to ask a question now before we move on? I'll remind those who are listening online that you can email your questions in, and Erin will bring them up to the panel at the end. Okay, why don't we move on? I think it's good. We'll save the questions for the discussion, which is our hope. I'm really pleased to now introduce Dr. Rizal Kurzarok, who's the Senior Deputy Cancer Center Director for Clinical Science and Murray Professor of Medicine at UC San Diego. I've been fortunate to know Rizal for many years, and I saw her single-handedly working with her group build the largest phase 1 program probably in the country or the world at MD Anderson. She's studied more than 300 different compounds in clinical trials. So Rizal's going to now share her experience with us.